All right, let's go over some acid-base balance and how the body system is going to correct the imbalance between these acids in our body that build up and how they control that. So acid base is a range or a value that we get when we do a blood gas, and it basically measures this type of amount of hydrogen ions that's still ranging in the blood. Here we see that the normal range is 735, so 7.45. Anything lower than 7.35 is more of an acidic condition. 7.45 and above is more of the opposite of an acid, so it's a base. We'd like to live within that 7.40 range in order to make the cells function. Again, if it's too acidic and too basic or alkalytic, the body systems tend not to work. These cells just do not function well. These are some of the players as far as a lab value, and we do draw blood gas and we're looking at these values. These are the ones that we're paying attention to. I'm going to show you here carbon dioxide is an acid. It's a toxin. Usually results as a problem in the respiratory system. Normal ranges is usually, like, again, something around 35 to 45. These ranges may change depending on what lab system you're using and how it's reported. This here, HCO3 is bicarbonate. It's usually it's a buffer that's found in the blood. And these two counteract each other, the acid and the buffer, the alkaline and the acid, to keep us within these normal ranges 7.35 to 7.45. So blood gas, again, the carbon dioxide is the measurement of how well the cardiovascular respiratory system is working, primarily respiratory function. And then the bicarbonate is also a relation of how well the kidney and the cardiovascular system, because we have to have blood perfusing the kidneys in order for the kidneys to work, but how well they're either excreting bicarbonate or excreting hydrogen ions. And we'll review that soon. A buffer, again, is more alkalotic, or a buffer tries to take an acid and make it into a weak acid. Also on the opposite side, if it's too alkalotic, the buffer tries to convert that back down into a weaker acid. Here you see these are some of the buffer systems that are the first line of defense when an acidic condition where hydrogen or carbon dioxide in the body is overwhelming and it's causing the pH to change and stay outside of those ranges of 7.35 to 7.45. Keep in mind there are other toxins that can cause this change, so there's poisons that people could take, as well as diabetic ketones, for an example. So here's what the buffer is doing. It's taking that acid, the hydrogen ion, and the bicarbonate is forming together, and they're forming what's called carbonic acid. You see that equation there next to this yellow here. And this carbonic acid now becomes a weaker acid, and it has less effects on the body itself, but it's able then to be converted in the respiratory tree. We'll look at that soon, and converted and excreted and turned into something that's not very toxic to us, if you take a look at that. Now the respiratory system is the second line of defense, and as that hydrogen ion is attached to the bicarb and the buffer system, it turns into that weak acid again, but we're able to then off-gas this, if you will. So a person that may be affected by a acid concentration in their blood may start to have more of this type of heavy breathing. So let's take an example, the diabetic person that has DKA. His respiratory rate is much faster and deeper, and that Kussmaul type respirations is trying to overdrive and rid the body by getting rid of that acid, and it's changing the ketones and that acidic content in the blood and transitioning it into a form that it can get rid of and carbon dioxide. The kidneys, we talked about that. They would excrete hydrogen ions, and they can maintain the bicarbonate level so that we have enough buffers to take care of that system. Remember, the buffer is the first line of defense, respiratory is our second line of defense, and third line here is the kidneys. So they can excrete extra acids and excreting that hydrogen out. We're just showing us a picture here of the renal system. We have the glomerulus here, that's that filtration mix system, and blood comes in from these arterioles and returns out toxins then and things that we want to excrete go through the capsule. Excess water is picked up and transferred out into, now it leaves this last distal convoluted loop and out to the kidney where it's formed up in urine. During this process, there's a change in osmolarity, and you can see how water is being excreted. And then here we have bicarbonate ions being reuptaked and hydrogen ions being excreted out here. So you can see in this diagram, it's showing you what's happening with water and hydrogen and how it's able to return and keep the buffer bicarbonate. All right, so there are 4 different types, well, more than 4 different types, but primary metabolic acidosis is where the pH is low again. Respiratory acidosis is where the pH is low. Metabolic alkalosis, where the pH now is going up above that 7.45. Respiratory alkalosis, again, the pH is above. And then we have mixed balance, so we could have both metabolic and respiratory acidosis, or we could have a metabolic and it's being compromised, or not compromised, it's being compensated by the respiratory center, and we could say mixed, where it's metabolic acidosis and a respiratory alkalosis. We'll take a look at this a little later in the classroom. So metabolic acidosis, again, this is a buildup of either some kind of toxin such as lactic acid, things like where the person has been laying on themselves for quite a long time and they've been down for days and they just haven't moved. All of the tissue has been compromised and compressed, and those cells have been without adequate blood flow and circulation. They can't create ATP. The cells start to denature. Those cells start to die. Tissue starts to die, and it starts to leach out chemicals into the blood, and it releases, those chemicals cause acidic content into the body. So that's one way. Or we can think about the DKA patient. And again, here we see the bicarb change into a carbonic acid, which is the weaker acid. So it's taking this buffer system is trying to bind to those acids that have been leached out into the blood supply, and to try to turn it into weaker acid in hopes that maybe we can get this out by ventilating. Here are some other ones for you to think about. And as we go over our scenarios in class and relate back to these medical conditions, here we have some endocrine disorder, diabetes, ketoacidosis, you have sepsis, burns, the cardiovascular system is unable to push things around, so lactic acid. We have, it could be anoxic, either from, from some kind of strangulation, or in the case of rhabdo. Yeah. And then the other ones I mentioned, that you could have just external toxins being exposed in the environment or workplace. Other causes, you could have intestinal issues such as diarrhea, and then we see that the kidneys may not be functioning well. Respiratory acidosis, here we point to the chronic condition where the person is always on the higher side of a respiratory acidosis. Their probably pH ranges just below that 7.4 on a normal basis, and they're building up excess base to maintain that 7.4 right there in the middle range. But these would be other conditions, as well as somebody who's just taken a bunch of narcotic medications or has been exposed to carfentanil or even using illicit substances such as heroin. This could even be your patient that you overdose with a narcotic medication, or someone that you use the paralytic assisted intubation protocol and you're not ventilating uh, during the times that you need to, and that carbon dioxide builds up. And here's some other conditions. Here you see the mention of the opiates. Metabolic alkalosis. This is where the pH now went from the acidic content 7.35 and below, and we went above that 7.4 to above that 7.45, and they're saying we have way too much base. We've gotten rid of too much of our acid, and a lot of acids in the GI tract, where we use these acids to denature and break up the materials of digestion so that it can be used for sources of glucose and energy. And you can see where this has been lost when we have a lot of vomiting going on. It also says here if the kidneys are moving a lot of that fluid through the kidney and pushing it out. Respiratory alkalosis, this is it's infrequent, I would have to say, because we don't have many patients overventilating where they just become chronic respiratory alkalosis. But it may be where they're hyperventilating and taking a lot more breaths, and the frequency and rate and the depth of breaths, the quality of breaths are increased. A mixed balance. Now these we'll probably have to really take our time to go over in class, and we'll use some exercises to just determine where the CO2 is going and how that affects pH, where the hydrogen ions are going and how they're affecting bicarbs, so whether the bicarbs there and how that's affecting the pH. Because if the CO2 is high, then that means there's a lot of toxin, the CO2 side, high toxin, CO2 side, respiratory. So we're thinking about respiratory. If it's too high, it's an acid. Respiratory CO2, we have a respiratory acidosis. If we have a condition where our bicarbonate is too low, then we know that the pH is going to be low. So and again, we'll take a look at this in the classroom with the mixed balances. So we may have what's called a respiratory acidosis, which is compensated by a respiratory alkalosis. Or we may have both a respiratory acidosis and a metabolic acidosis going on. All right, well, let's go ahead and get some of these exercises done so we have the understanding of how the acid-base balance, carbonic acid, then binds to it, and then we have a breathable gas on one side, which is carbon dioxide, and then we have a hydrogen ion within the blood, and how this is transferred back and forth.